So in today's episode, I want to talk about the self, because the self seems quite a powerful concept, especially in my line of work in terms of therapy and counselling and the struggles that we all have around being part of this human condition that we're all part of. And we often talk about the self. And so I want to just talk about, an idea around the self that perhaps you might not have thought of before, because we tend to think of the self as some sort of unchanging, steadfast thing. This thing that represents us, and who we are is who we are. And yet, there is a concept of the self which, especially amongst those people who do narrative therapy, which is one of the therapies that I operate in, there's an idea of the self which is very different to that. There's an idea of the self which doesn't say that the self is something necessarily within us, but that the self is actually constructed, that it kind of exists, if you like, in the space between us and the world that we're interacting with. And when you think about it, that has a certain truth to it, a certain resonance anyway. That when I'm with some people, I feel a different version of me than when I'm with others. And so in that sense, it wouldn't be like that if the self was just a fixed thing within me. But the self exists, the narrative therapists say, in that space between me and you, where we interact. And so that's why, for instance, that I'm a certain version of me with one friend and a completely different version of me with another. That the interaction that we have with the world kind of has some sort of say over the self that we exhibit in that moment. So it's not inside us, but when I'm interacting with the world, that space between me and the world, that's where the self is. And so I'm different, for instance, if I'm talking to people about, a therapy research paper, or if I'm talking to some friends about music. It's a different version of me. And it's an interesting idea when we think of the things that we struggle with. So things like anxiety or depression or any of the challenges that we have. Because if we can think of the self as something that isn't kind of steadfast and unchanging, but something which is constantly changing because it doesn't live within us, but lives within the space between us and the people that we're interacting with, the environments that we're interacting with, well, we can start observing ourselves a little bit differently. We can start asking really interesting questions like, well, I might say that I'm depressed now, but is there a version of me that hardly ever gets depressed? In fact, is there a version of me that's never been depressed? Because when we ask those questions, we come up with some really exciting answers. Like we might say, do you know what's funny? I was never depressed at any point while I was at university. The version of me that went to university didn't actually have depression at all. And so a person who sees themselves as having depression can suddenly realise that there are versions of themselves that have never had depression. There are versions of themselves that maybe have it a little bit, but hardly ever. And versions of themselves that have it quite a lot. And so it transforms the challenge that we're facing from something that's very fixed and concrete and I have it, to something which is more fluid, to something where we can see aspects of ourselves and versions of ourselves where we've never had this issue at all. The version of ourself that is never depressed and has never been depressed. And the same with anxiety. Someone who might struggle with this constant sense of anxiety as they see it, but when they think of themselves in this multiple way, where they think of themselves not as the self within them, but the self as the space between them and the world that they're interacting with, can suddenly see places where the anxiety is much lower, can suddenly see places where the anxiety doesn't exist at all, might even find versions of themselves that has never had anxiety. And the power of this is that once we can start recognizing versions of ourselves who don't actually struggle with that problem quite so much, or even if at all, that gives us a lot of information, doesn't it, in terms of how we might be able to expand that version of ourselves into more of our lives. So that the thing that we're challenged with, the problem that we are struggling with, whether it be anxiety or depression or anything else, actually becomes less and less, because we begin to occupy those versions of ourself which don't have depression, which don't have anxiety, which don't have the challenge, or at least have it much, much less. And we can even then recognize the versions of ourselves that have it the most, and start to take action to step out of those roles, to step out of those interactions, to understand really what is causing us the most distress, and where in our life the distress isn't there at all. And so I like this idea about versions of ourself, about the idea that the self doesn't exist fixedly within us, but is a much more malleable, fluid thing that exists in the space between us and the people and environment that we're interacting with, because it allows us to see ourselves in a different way, in a multiplicity of ways, which gives us some clues as to how we can actually overcome that challenge, lose that difficulty altogether, and also find the places where the struggle is really showing up. Because once we've got that information, we can refine our life, we can tweak ourselves so that more and more, tweak our lives so that more and more the versions of ourself that don't face the challenge quite so much are the ones that get to show up. Now, if you like this idea, you might be interested in working with me. I'm Alun Parry, and you can find me at liverpoolpsychotherapy.co.uk. I work in person or online if you're not local to me. And you can find my blogs as well if you want to read up some more at alunparry.com. That's ALUN Parry.com. You can also find other episodes of this podcast at liverpoolpsychotherapy.co.uk/podcast. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you on the next one.